Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to News from the Torah. Today is April 25th, 2021, the 13th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, and we're in the Torah portion of Emor. I am Leah Roney. Welcome to our show. Today we're going to discuss a really important topic, the topic of leadership. The entire Torah portion this week discusses the leadership of the Kohanim, the priests, the special holiness the priests have to maintain as the representatives of the Jewish people in the temple. And we will take this idea of Jewish leadership to different places. This coming Shabbat is the day of Lag Baomer. It's the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer, a special time period between the holidays of Passover and Shavuot, during which we count every single day as the Jewish people left Egypt and were on their way to the Sinai mountain to receive the Torah. So as the Jewish people were counting the 50 days between Passover and Shavuot, so are we counting days to receiving the Torah. And this special time is called the Omer. What was meant to be a festive period became a mourning period after the destruction of the temple, as 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died during this time, and they finished dying on the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer, which will be this coming Shabbat. And we will discuss the leadership of Rabbi Akiva that enabled him to get up from this tragedy and rebuild the Jewish world of Torah. 33rd day of Omer is also the day of the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar and the founder of the Kabbalistic tradition. So we'll talk about him. And finally, we will talk with Dr. Susan Rutland about the legacy of Izzy Leibler, a modern day Jewish leader. All of this on this show. Please don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Hello and welcome back. So as we said, this week is a very special time because it is leading up to Lag Baomer, the 33rd day of the period of the counting of the Omer. This was supposed to be a festive time when we're counting down days towards receiving the Torah on Shavuot. Yet after the destruction of the temple, it became a tragic time. After the Romans destroyed the Holy Temple in the year 72 of the Common Era, they destroyed most of Jewish life in Judea. Yet 50 years after the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people revolted in what is known as the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The ideologue of that rebellion was none other than Rabbi Akiva, arguably the greatest sage of Jewish history. Rabbi Akiva has a very modest beginning. He came from a very simple family and was an illiterate shepherd until he was 40 years old. However, he was noticed by the daughter of his boss, Kalba Savoy. Kalba Savoy was one of the richest people of Jerusalem, and he employed Akiva as a shepherd of his flock. Kalba Savoy's daughter, Rachel, who was one of the most beautiful and educated women of Jerusalem, noticed this simple shepherd. And she had the ability to see in him something special, something that nobody else could see. Rabbi Akiva testified later on that at the time when he was a shepherd, he was illiterate, he had such hatred for Torah scholars because they saw themselves as holier and more special than the rest of the Jewish folk. So he really hated Torah scholars. Yet Rachel could see through the veneer and saw special qualities and sterling character of Rabbi Akiva. So she made a deal with him. She asked him if he would be willing to go and learn Torah, and in that case she would marry him. And of course, he jumped at the opportunity. But her father disavowed the couple, and they were forced to live in very, 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 very poor conditions. Rabbi Akiva went out to learn Torah when his youngest son was 5. The father and the son, the 5-year-old and the 40-year-old, went to school together to study ABC, the alphabet, to study how to read. And Rabbi Akiva started learning at the age of 40 from the very, very beginning, literally from the ABCs, until over the period of 40 years, he became the greatest sage of the Jewish people. So much so that the Talmud says that when Moses saw Rabbi Akiva in a prophecy, he said, "You have such a great person. Why do you need me to give the Torah? Rabbi Akiva should be the one to give the Torah." Rabbi Akiva not only became the greatest sage, but he had 12,000 couples of students, 24,000 students who were his followers. And as the Jewish people prepared to revolt against the Romans under the military leadership of the Bar Kochva, Rabbi Akiva gave the ideological support for this revolt, and all of his students engaged in the fighting with Bar Kochva against the Romans. However, all of these 24,000 students died between Passover and the 33rd day of the counting of Omer. 24,000 people died during the span of 1 month. It is like having 700 funerals every single day. And obviously each one of those students had a wife and children and parents. The Talmud says that they died in a pandemic of what's called askara. It's a breathing disease, but there are other suggestions that it is possible that they died in the fighting against the Romans. At any rate, Rabbi Akiva lost all of his students in 1 month. Consider it, a head of a huge movement with hundreds of thousands of followers is left bereft with no students and no followers at all in 1 month. And what is so amazing about Rabbi Akiva is not that he was just a great scholar and not just a great sage, but what is so amazing is the Talmud says that after 24,000 of his students passed away, he got up from his mourning and he went and found 5 new students. And those 5 new students were the ones who made sure that the Torah was preserved and passed it on to the future generations. Now we can ask, what happened? Why did such a tragedy befall Rabbi Akiva? Why did all of his students die? And the Talmud says that his students passed away because they would not show proper respect to each other. Now this sounds to be a very wondrous statement, because Rabbi Akiva is the one who said in this Talmud that loving a fellow Jew is the greatest, most central principle of the Torah. So if loving your fellow Jew is the central principle of the Torah, how is it possible that his students would not show proper respect to each other? And what does even proper respect mean? So proper respect really means empathy. It means hearing and understanding the position of your fellow person, hearing them out, giving them a chance to express themselves. And instead of thinking, okay, what am I going to answer back to them, really hearing them out, asking them why they think what they think, understanding their position. And once you understand their position, you can also share your position. And then you can have dialogue, and maybe you'll reach some kind of a compromise. Maybe you'll reach some kind of a third statement, or maybe you will be able to explain to each other and convince each other. But one way or the other, a central principle here is hearing the other person out. And this is what his students could not do. They could not give space for a different position. They thought that only they were right. And this kind of Torah does not have continuity. All of Torah is built on dialogue and the ability to hear different concepts and different explanations and then arrive at the truth. Because when we cannot hear each other, we cannot arrive at truth. We're so concerned about our own ego and about our own position that we don't give place to other people in other positions. And ironically, it was Rachel, Rabbi Akiva's wife, who was able to see beyond the veneer and see the internal truth of the person. And this is something that her husband was not able to pass to his first set of 24,000 students. Maybe because during those 24 years when he was still learning Torah, they were separated. The Talmud says that Rabbi Akiva, after he learned how to read, left with the permission and the blessing of his wife for 12 years to learn in a yeshiva. And after 12 years, he came back and he heard her say, I would be willing to let him go for another 12 years. So he turned around and went off for another 12 years. And after 24 years, when he's a great sage, Rachel comes to him and his students are about to push away this woman who is trying to make her way to their great leader. And Rabbi Akiva says, leave her alone. Everything that I have and everything that you have, everything that we have achieved, all belongs to her. And this is when a great reconciliation happens between Rabbi Akiva and his father-in-law, Kal B'Savua. But because he was separated from his wife, and because he was separated from this source of the ability to see beyond the veneer, his first set of students had a Torah that was unsustainable. So he went out, like we said, and found 5 new students. Just consider it. It is as if a leader of a great movement, a person who has to fill a stadium to contain all of his students, now goes to teach a group of people who can sit around a small table. 5 students. But those 5 students made sure that the Torah was preserved. And one of those students was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar and the founder of the Kabbalistic tradition. Obviously, he did not found it. He just wrote down the teachings that have been passed on for generations, starting from Moses. But he is the person who learned the Zohar and who wrote it down, and we'll talk about him a little bit after the break. The story of Rabbi Akiva and his students is especially relevant to us this year, after we experienced a big pandemic, and in many parts of the world, as this pandemic is still raging. And the most important lesson here is that there is always a way to go back and start anew. It is mind-boggling how Rabbi Akiva could get up from his tragedy and start from scratch. And how often do we, when we have a setback, say, oh, there's no use. There's no point. I tried it and it doesn't work. And instead of picking ourselves up and going forward, we get stuck in our failure. There's a beautiful verse in the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, that says, Sheva yipol tzaddik v'kam. A righteous person falls down 7 times and he gets up. And Rabbi Hutner, a famous rabbi from the past century, said that this is not a consolation. The point is not to tell us that even righteous people fall and get up. This is the method. The way to become righteous is to fall and get up and fall and get up and fall and get up, fail and get up time and time again. And only through failure we can learn. And this is the only way to attain anything. This is the greatest lesson of Jewish leadership we can learn from Rabbi Akiva. Fall and get up. More about this right after the break.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back. So in the previous segment, we talked about Rabbi Akiva, the greatest sage of all times. And in this segment, we would like to talk about a different personality also connected to this special day of the 33rd day of the Omer, Lag Baomer, and that is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is buried in the town of Miron, right outside of Tzfat, in Galilee, in northern Israel. And every year, for his day of passing, Lag Baomer, between 250 and 500,000 people gather to celebrate this day. Now, why do we celebrate the day of a passing of a sage? It is said that on the day of his passing, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai revealed exalted secrets of the Torah. The celebrations are marked with the lighting of huge bonfires to signify the brilliance of the light of the Zohar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's book is called the Zohar, which literally means illumination or brilliance. And it also signifies the lighting of bonfires that the Bar Kochva soldiers would light to see each other and to pass messages. The other custom that is marked at these celebrations, Lag Baomer, is the cutting of hair for young Jewish boys. Jewish families usually leave their boys' hair out long until the age of 3. And on Lag Baomer, 3-year-olds get their first haircut. And when their hair is cut, the side locks are left on. So this is another custom that is marked on Lag Baomer. And if you go online on YouTube and type in Lag Baomer Miron, you can see some of these celebrations with lots of singing and dancing and bonfires. It's just a very lively event. Imagine almost 500,000 people showing up to celebrate. Last year, unfortunately, due to COVID, only a couple of hundred people were allowed to go up to Miron. And this year, the celebrations are also limited to about 15,000 people. But still, it's a great, lively celebration, and hopefully in the coming years, it will go back to its grandeur. So why do 500,000 people show up to celebrate the passing of a sage who has not been around for 2,000 years? What is so special about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? And the seminal story about him in the Talmud is actually about a discussion that he had with 2 of his colleagues, other students of Rabbi Akiva. So if you remember, we said that Rabbi Akiva's first set of 24,000 students passed away because they would not hear each other out and not give proper respect to each other's opinions. But here's another story about a disagreement among 3 sages. So the Talmud says in the Tractate of Shabbat that 3 sages, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosei, and Rabbi Shimon, sat and had a discussion, and there was a 4th person there called Yehuda. So they discussed Romans, how Romans behaved and what Romans did. Now you have to remember, this is about 10 years after the Romans violently put out the Jewish revolt and basically decimated Judea. At the time, Romans had the same status as Nazis. They were cruel and they were anti-Semitic. And in this discussion, Rabbi Yehuda says, we have to give due to the amazing actions of the Romans. They established markets, they built bridges, they built bathhouses. They're really doing things to rebuild this country, so we have to give them their due. And Rabbi Yossi didn't say anything. He was conflicted. And Rabbi Shimon got very angry and he said, no, everything that they do for themselves. They build markets to create immorality. They build bathhouses for themselves, and they build bridges so they can collect taxes. The fourth person who was there shared this conversation with somebody, who shared this with somebody else, and in the end, the emperor heard about it. So Rabbi Yehuda, who had good things to say about the Romans, was promoted, and he was nominated to be the first person to speak at every public gathering. Rabbi Yossi, who didn't say anything, was sent into exile. And Rabbi Shimon, there was a price tag put on his head, and he was wanted to be executed. So Rabbi Shimon and his son hid in the Beit Midrash, and his wife would bring him food every day. And then, as the Romans were searching for him, he was concerned that his wife would be caught and tortured and would reveal his hiding place. So he and Rabbi Eliezer, his son, hid in a cave. They took off their clothes and they would dig their bodies into the sand and learn Torah the whole day. And there was a miracle. A carob tree grew by the cave, and there was a spring of water that appeared. So they ate carobs and drank water and learned Torah the whole day. They would come out of the sand to get dressed to pray and then put themselves back into the sand. And this is how they stayed for 12 years, every day learning Torah. It is said in the tradition that Eliyahu the prophet would come and learn with them, and this is how Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer learned the entire Kabbalistic tradition and all of the Zohar. After 12 years, Eliyahu came to let them know that the emperor passed away and that they're now in the clear, so they came out. And they walked around and they were in shock that people were still going on with their normal lives, planting and gathering crops and just going on with their lives, and everywhere they would look would burn because they could not stand the mundane reality of this world after this great holiness. So God came out and told them, did you just come out of a cave to destroy my world? Go back into the cave. And they spent another 12 months in the cave, and after they came out, Rabbi Eliezer was still distraught that people would go on with their mundane lives instead of devoting their lives to holiness. But Rabbi Shimon told him, look, it's enough that the two of us are so connected to God. Let people live their lives. And then they met a man running home with 2 bouquets of myrtle branches. And they asked him, where are you going? He said, I'm running home because it's almost Shabbat. And they asked, what do you need the myrtle branches for? He said, for the honor of Shabbat, to smell them. And they said to each other, look how Jewish people are connected to God's Torah, to God's mitzvot. And that calmed them down. And as we look at this story, I think what we can see are 2 ways that the Jewish people went ahead to deal with the exile of the past 2,000 years. Rabbi Yehuda had to see the good in the actions of the Romans. He had to look at the reality and find a redeeming quality, because this was the only way the Jewish people could survive in the exile among the nations for the next 2,000 years. And he became, obviously through God's intervention, the chief speaker at every place, because he would see the Jewish people and tell them, look, the situation is difficult. We're living under Roman rule, but we have to make the best we can with the situation. It's really an internal, inside look that goes beyond the veneer, just like Rabbi Akiva's wife, goes beyond the veneer of the unfortunate circumstances and tries to find the inner blessing the redeeming quality of everything. And Rabbi Yehuda's teachings became the foundation of the Mishnah, the revealed Torah that has been guiding Jewish law for the past 2,000 years. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had a different approach. He did not look at the veneer and look for redeeming qualities. He looked for the inner meaning. What are the Romans really looking to do through all these quote-unquote wonderful actions? And he had to go into hiding. He had to go underground, under the radar, into the cave, and the hidden teachings of the Torah were revealed to him. He wrote down the hidden teachings of the Torah so they would be preserved as the Jewish people were about to go into exile. And those hidden teachings have stayed under the radar in this proverbial cave for the past 2,000 years. They were passed from teacher to student, from teacher to student, from teacher to student, and they have been really hidden. This is how Kabbalah really means something you get, something that you receive. They were passed down, and it is only in this last few generations that Kabbalistic and secret teachings are coming out and being taught more in the open, thanks to the Hasidic movement. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, in the introduction to his book Likutei Moharan, quotes a saying from the Zohar that the Jewish people will leave the exile and be redeemed through the book of the Zohar, because redemption is really all about seeing through the veneer of the world and seeing God and godliness in everything in the physical reality. And this is a very special internal look that sees the world as the secret hiding place of God. And it is only in the past 200-300 years that these teachings have been coming out into the open and are now becoming more and more popularized through the Hasidic movement. So as Rabbi Shimon's teachings are becoming more and more popular, and as we understand that through his teachings we can get an internal piercing look into the workings of the world, into the godly forces that lived every single part of existence, as we're becoming more and more godly and closer to the time of the redemption, more and more people join the celebrations around Rabbi Shimon and his amazing legacy, the legacy that stayed under the radar for 2,000 years, in the belief that a day will come when it will come out and lead the Jewish people out of the exile. After the break, we'll hear about a modern Jewish leader that also had the wherewithal to stand up to a great power and win.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, I am Walter Bingham. If you want to hear the news behind the news and the true perspective on world affairs, then the Walter Bingham File is the program for you. We bring you interviews with the movers and shakers, political commentaries, and on-the-spot reports of events as they happen. All here every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it's all archived on our website. Make it a date.
Welcome back. And on this segment, we're with Dr. Suzanne Rutland, Professor Emeritus at the Department of Hebrew, Biblical, and Jewish Studies at the University of Sydney, and a renowned Australian Jewish historian. And we are talking to her about Izzy Leibler, following the book that she recently put out called Lone Voice, The Wars of Izzy Leibler. Mr. Leibler passed away a few weeks ago. And in this segment devoted to Jewish leadership, we would like to discuss with Dr. Rutland the personality of Mr. Leibler and his special brand of Jewish leadership. Hello, Dr. Rutland. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I think some of our listeners might not be familiar with Mr. Leibler. Could you please tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, of course. Izzy Leibler was born in Antwerp, and at the age of 4, he and his parents managed to escape Europe and come to Melbourne. His mother saw the danger clouds. So he grew up as a refugee child in Melbourne. And following his studies and being in Israel, his father suddenly passed away, forcing him to return to Melbourne to look after the family diamond business after having spent a few months in Antwerp learning the trade. Izzy was a brilliant businessman. He went from there to building the largest travel company in the Asia Pacific region, indeed one of the largest in the world, called Jet Set. But for him, money was not the issue. He used his travel company as a stepping stone for his passions, which were Australian Jewry and world Jewry. And his passions started at a very young age with social activism for Soviet Jewry. Following a visit to Israel in 1959 and being enlisted by the legendary Shaul Avigor, whom the older generation of Israelis will know of, he really, for 30 years, until 1989, was a moving figure in the Soviet Jewry story. And I'm sure when we look at his leadership style, we can come back to that. But Izzy not only was that, but he became key leader of Australian Jewry. He headed the National Australian Jewish Council for 4 terms, only one of 3 people to do that. He became deeply involved with the World Jewish Congress, ending up as vice president and afterwards honorary vice president. And again, we can come back to that in terms of leadership. And finally, he continued to act as an unofficial diplomat for the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He'd always wanted to become a diplomat, but unfortunately with his father's death, life took him on a different path. And in that, he played a very key role in India and China's recognition of Israel.
So if there's one trademark story that you could share about Izzy and his leadership, what would it be?
Well, there are probably a number, but the one I'd like to share is the one with his big battle with Dr. Nachman Goldman in 1966, because Goldman believed in silent diplomacy, and he was very opposed, strongly opposed to demonstrations on the part of Soviet Jewry. And those of us from the diaspora will know that demonstrations became the trademark for the campaign for liberating Soviet Jewry. Well, Izzy strongly disagreed with Goldman. And in 1966, and you do need to remember at that time, Izzy was born in 1934. He was a 32-year-old. And he took on the veteran leader who was president not only of the World Jewish Congress, but also of the World Zionist Organization. And he attacked him and said, this is Stadlanut, this is, being subversive to the Soviet authorities in front of a major meeting of the World Jewish Congress. So this was Izzy's really leadership style. He was never afraid to stand up, regardless of the ramifications, for what he believed in. Of course, in this case, as history was to prove, particularly after the Leningrad hijack story, that the secret diplomacy was not going to work with the Soviets. You needed to stand up to them.
That takes a lot of courage. Where do you think he drew that courage from? Where did he draw that ability to stand up to authority?
I think that's a great question. And I think it was very much part of his legacy as a refugee Jewish boy. Already in his school days, there was an incident of anti-Semitism which occurred in his government school, high school, and where a number of boys non-Jewish boys pushed Jewish boys into a shed and locked them in. Now, the other Jewish boys did not want to take action, but Izzy was not one to stand by the side. And with a couple of other non-Jewish friends, he found out who was involved and then physically targeted each of those people. Following that, there were no more incidents of anti-Semitism. So I think it was this experience as a refugee boy where he had been prepared to stand up against anti-Semitism. And by the way, the fight against anti-Semitism, which obviously was what Soviet Jewry's fight was all about, Soviet anti-Semitism, really became the mantra of his leadership style. And he would refer back to it in interviews with me. Indeed, even when we did the amazing Bar-Ilan book launch of my biography, he spoke about that incident at high school as being formative.
What prompted you to choose him to write this biography?
Well, I didn't choose him, to be honest. He chose me. I had not planned to write Izzy's biography. What I had planned to do, and still have to finish doing, I must say, is to write a history of Jewish communal advocacy in post-war Australia. And for that history, the president who followed Izzy for the national organization, Dan Steinman, had actually approached me to write that history. And she then did fundraising for the book that still has to appear, including asking Izzy for support. And as it happened, I was in Israel at the end of 1999 and met with Izzy and was coming to Israel in 2000 for a sabbatical. And he offered me access to his archive, to his private archive for this communal history. Well, when I arrived, I was bowled over, and I'm still bowled over by that archive. He had 40 volumes on Soviet Jewry. And needless to say, I got diverted from Jewish communal history to Australia, the battle for Soviet Jewry, Goldman. I wrote a major chapter on Goldman and Soviet Jewry that was published in the more recent biography of Nachman Goldman, etc., etc. And while working on those different projects, Izzy saw the way I took his archive very seriously and kept saying to me, I would like you to write your biography. And eventually I got there, and now I have to finish the communal history that started it all.
Interesting. So if our listeners could take one lesson from Izzy, his life and his leadership, what would that be?
Stand up for what you believe in and to be not afraid to follow integrity, regardless of its ramifications. And I think that's seen very clearly with his battle against the corruption that was taking place in the World Jewish Congress, which eventually, after an enormous lot of pain on his part through a threatened libel action, he was proved fully justified in and was invited back as honorary vice president of the World Jewish Congress, a position he filled until his death. So stand up for what you believe in and don't be afraid. I think that is the central message of Izzy's leadership. and it's to stand up for social justice, for integrity, for opposition to corruption. These were key motives in his life.
Dr. Rutland, thank you so much. Lone voice, the wars of Izzy Leibler. In this generation that is so conflict avoidant, I think it is especially important to hear these messages that sometimes we have to stand up for what we believe in, for our integrity, and sometimes that might involve a war. But after 30 years of fighting the greatest evil force of our generation, Soviet Russia, even a war like this can be won. Dr. Rutland, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you again.
And thank you to all of you for joining us today on this episode of News from the Torah, all about Jewish leadership. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom!
Okay, wait a minute.
Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling for the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.